Start. So welcome to the fourth installment of Healthy at Home. So Healthy at Home, this is a webinar series designed to keep you guys healthy in these strange times. I think with the more time that we have now, just the space that we have to think, we can start implementing some healthier habits. And this is why I put together this series here. We've talked about body composition the first week. Second week, we talked about stress and hormones. And last week, 2 weeks ago now, we talked about nutrient density and eating for energy. And each week I've touched on this topic of the gut, because the gut really ties everything together. Without a healthy gut, then stress management, hormone management, body composition, and energy, it doesn't really happen optimally. And it really is fascinating because this is a new area of research. If I had spoken about this 10 years ago, well, I wouldn't have known anything 10 years ago. But also the research around this was really, really circumstantial and anecdotal. And the gut's been studied for a long time in medicine, but not usually in Western medicine. Often in traditional Chinese medicine, they speak more about organs, and one of those being the gut and how that can tie a lot of your health together. So a little bit about me, if you don't know me, I've been a coach since 2010, FDN practitioner, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner since 2016. What that means is I work holistically with the body, working on fitness, nutrition and lifestyle, and look to build health as opposed to fight disease or fight symptoms. And I do that through using fitness, nutrition, and lifestyle, and also conducting comprehensive testing on the hormones and also the gut. So if you've worked with a few of me, you've worked with me before, you may have done some testing on the hormones and gut, and you know the impact that that has on the rest of your health. And with adequate testing, we can set up the right health plan to suit you. So I've been doing that for a few years now, and just learning different bits of the puzzle that fit into what I consider relevant healthcare. So the gut is all about, we're going to talk about the gut all with today. We're talking everything to do with health, sickness, and disease. And when it comes to that and healthcare, Hippocrates, he's considered the father of medicine. And he said many years ago that all disease begins in the gut. So he knew that something was going on here. He knew that the gut had a big impact on how we look and feel. Although it couldn't be proven at the time, it was considered a lot of the problems that we were having were originating from the gut. And that's been the center of a lot of non-Westernized medicines for a long time. And they've been treating this for a long time. But we're just catching up because the research is just coming out now. A little wordplay. This is super interesting. So I'm a big fan of the origination of words and how we bring together words and create words, and then that word can then mean something. And one of them is hypochondria. So hypo, you might know, means below, and chondria actually means below the ribs. So in Western medicine, if we couldn't pinpoint something, we couldn't diagnose it, it was considered that person would be a hypochondriac. It's starting in their gut. And you might be familiar with that. You may have had a gut feeling about something, or if you meet someone, you can feel it in your gut that it might be a good decision or a bad decision. And that's not just your some sort of mystical thing that's going on. That's actually got a good grounding in science, and there's a lot that's going on from that's a lot of signals that are going from the gut to the brain. They're actually telling you relevant messages there. We're going to dig into that today. Stress in the gut. This is my man Hans Selye. He's one of my favorite scientists. He's considered the father of stress, and he was the first real guy to put together a model with stress and disease. He did a lot of research between the relationship between stress and disease. And I've talked about him previously in the hormone lectures, but this one is him talking about the connection between the brain and the gut. So the normal stress system that he came up with was the stress down to the hypothalamus and into the pituitary gland and into the adrenal glands here, and that secretes cortisol and things like that. But what he's got here, I love this photo, it's so cool. It's saying a stress response that can actually go straight to the gut here. So it can bypass this whole system, this normal system, and you can get a signal that goes straight to the gut without going through the normal adrenal stress cortex here. So there's two things going on. There's the adrenal stress, but also the gut-brain axis. And he said that in 1936. It's crazy. We're only just realizing it now. But let's talk about the gut and what it is. It's pretty simple. It's just a tube. The body is actually just a system of tubes. But the gut in particular is a tube that goes from the mouth to the anus. It goes a long way around. It's really big, but that's essentially what it is. A lot happens between the mouth and the anus, as we know, but the gut is essentially the tube. So when we're talking about the gut, we're talking about the tube. When we talk about the microbiome, that sexy new term that we all like to use, including myself, that includes everything that happens in between there. So all the microbes that are originating from there, that's referring to the microbiome. Why it's cool. So the gut is so cool. So many funky facts about it. I'll pick out a few of them here. It works independently of the brain. So that's why people say it has its own brain. It's home to 100 trillion microorganisms, and that's the gut microbiota. And that has 150 times greater gene pool than the human genome. That's why people say, are you more gut than brain? A lot of the hormones it will create are actually created in the gut. So serotonin being one of them. You might be familiar with the link between serotonin and mental health. If we take SSRIs, they're serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so that promote serotonin across the synaptic cleft. And that actually is promoted in the gut. And melatonin as well, that's our sleep hormone, comes from the gut. The vagus nerve, we're going to talk about that in a tick. My favorite one here, if you spread your whole gastrointestinal system out, it will cover a tennis court. It is massive, massive surface area. And about 70% of the immune system comes from the gut. So super important part of the body, and some cool things going on with it as well. Are we human, or are we that song? Great song. This is like an existential question to say, how much of us do we really own? And considering that the gut really has its own brain and its own way of doing things that we cannot sort of control, we've got to ask the question, how much are we human and how much are we gut microorganisms? Yeah, that digs into another topic, but I just wanted to pose that out there because I think it's pretty interesting. Why it matters. So why is the gut important? We digest, we assimilate foods, we produce neurotransmitters, the immune system, and it's the gatekeeper between us and the world. So when things get out of the gut, then it can get into our bloodstream, and that then affects us. So it's really important for keeping the good guys in, letting us have the good guys, but also getting rid of the bad guys. It really is our safeguard between us and potentially invading pathogens. When it goes bad, it's linked to all these conditions here. You may have experienced some of them, and really the list is endless. Gut inflammation is connected with so many other diseases, and we're finding it can actually be the cause of a lot of conditions now as well. For a long time, there was a question, is it the chicken or the egg? Is it the brain or the gut? What affects what? Does the brain affect the gut, or does the gut affect the brain? For example, if I have something stressful happening to me, I have a stressful response in the brain, that affects the gut. Or I have a condition of the brain, and then the gut coincidentally gets inflamed as well. But what we're actually finding now, it's more of the reverse. It's more of the gut being inflamed, and then that gut inflammation affecting the brain. And this was only discovered pretty recently, guys. This is a study, a meta-analysis done. I'll just read a quote out from it. Gut microorganism can activate the vagus nerve. I'm going to speak about the vagus nerve in a tick. It goes from the gut to the brain. And it appears to differentiate between non-pathogenic and pathogenic bacteria, and can induce both anxiogenic, and that increases anxiety, and anxiolytic, that reduces anxiety, effects. So what it's pretty much saying is that the gut alone, that can impact how we feel through the brain, as opposed to the other way around. And that comes from the vagus nerve. This study was only from 2016. And this is the vagus nerve we're talking about. 80% of the fibers of the vagus nerve go from the gut to the brain. whereas 20% of the fibers of the vagus nerve go from the brain to the gut. So if the gut is upset, the gut happens to be upset first, that consequently affects the brain. And that can result in lethargy, depression, all sorts of stuff. Bit of physiology. This is going to take less than 5 minutes, but this is what happens, and this is important for you to know, but to get through the next parts. So what happens with digestion? Digestion actually starts in the brain. So as soon as you start thinking about a food, I want you to think about a food now, something really delicious, maybe something you can have at breakfast or lunch. What you might be doing there is triggering saliva and a hormone cascade. It's actually been shown that even thinking about a food can create an insulin response. You know, insulin's correlated with weight gain. So only thinking about food can create that response. When we think about food, when we think we're going to get some, we start producing saliva. And when we eat the food, we start producing amylase. And amylase is produced in the saliva and it breaks down sugar into starch. That chewing, why chewing is so important, releases hydrochloric acid and enzymes to digest protein. That hydrochloric acid is in the stomach, and that prepares the small intestine for digestion. So the stomach will do some of the job here, and that'll go into the small intestine. And that's why chewing your food is so important, because chewing stimulates amylase. So if we're not producing amylase, we're not going to be digesting the sugar into starch. We're just going to be having it as whole. And that's leaving a hell of a lot of work for the stomach to do and the small intestine to do. And last thing we want is leftover food here. That can create bad bacteria too. Stomach's really acidic. That breaks it down into the small intestine. And then that goes into carbs are going to sugars, proteins going to amino acids. They go into the body for energy or for building blocks and repair, providing they go through the intestinal wall. So they're absorbed the intestinal wall here, and that goes into the body. That's the best scenario. Great scenario. It works really well, providing we chew. Now, the villi, this is where it gets cool. This is known as villi or microvilli. And the best way to think about it, they line the gut, the surface of the gut, and they absorb nutrients. So they kind of work like coral. They actually look like coral or hair follicle. They're really small. They're more like the size, actually much smaller than hair follicles. They're tiny. So if they're intact, they grab onto the nutrients and send them into the bloodstream so that we can use them. So really important role. Villi are attached all around the gut. So we want those to be healthy. The problem is if that gut lining and that villi is compromised, and it can very easily get compromised, they're very sensitive, then we can't digest our nutrients. We can digest, we can take in the amino acids and sugar, so protein and sugar we can a little, somewhat, but fats we cannot. And this poses a big problem because you might have heard of something called fat soluble vitamins. A lot of vitamins and minerals need fat to cross over into the body. So a lot of the nutrients that we take in, antioxidants, beta carotene, can only be absorbed when we eat fat. But if the gut lining is damaged, and a lot of the time it is, trust me, we've done some tests on this, and that means that the fat is not being digested. And when that fat can't be digested, that has unintended consequences, diarrhea being one of them. So it just goes to show there how vital the gut lining is, because it provides us with our health. Like, you can be making really good choices. You can be eating salmon and broccoli at each meal, or maybe not at each meal, every day, healthy meal there. But if that microvilli is not intact, you won't be getting the most out of that meal. And this is what it looks like. One of the problems, leaky gut. You may have heard of leaky gut before. It's kind of a colloquial term for intestinal permeability. I'm trying to get myself out of the way. There we go. So intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut, that's when vitamins and minerals and pathogens leak from the small intestine to the bloodstream, and as a result of a leaky barrier between the intestine and the bloodstream. So let's have a look at this. These little coral things here are the villi. They're the hair follicles, and they grab onto the good stuff, pass it through, and so that we can use them in the body, into the cells. Now, these are known as tight junctions. That's a junction there, and this is a healthy mucosal barrier. This here is an inflamed or leaky tight junction and intestinal barrier, and you can see the gaps and the arrows going through there. So what happens when we're under GI distress, a lot of the toxins, pathogens, and antibiotics, whatever we're taking in, the stuff that we take in but we don't want to get into the bloodstream, can penetrate the bloodstream through a leaky gut. It's leaking due to the damaged villi, and that creates all sorts of problems when these things get into the bloodstream. An IgG immune response, IgA immune response, B and T cell release, and autoimmune conditions can happen from here. Nutrient malabsorption, food sensitivities. This is a theory for why a lot of food sensitivities can happen. But the biggest one to explain is inflammation. When this stuff is getting into the bloodstream, the body's going to have a big inflammatory response to say, hey, mate, something's up. Something is invading my system. And it all comes back to that healthy mucosal barrier. So nutrient malabsorption, inflammation, fatigue, autoimmune conditions, that makes you feel pretty shit. And you can see why. If you've got stuff in your bloodstream that shouldn't be there, it can make you feel pretty rubbish. Gluten, bacteria, yeast, microbes can all get into that bloodstream as well. Why does it happen? So why does it feel that way? Think of it like inflammation. So the body is chronically inflamed. So if you've got a chronically upset gut, if this is happening all the time, can you imagine how shit you feel? Like all the time, chronic inflammation, chronic fatigue, this is all related to a leaky gut. And that brings into play an important question. Is it the gluten or is it the gut? And this is one of the theories around food intolerances. So I'm going to pose a situation now. The gut is leaky. So we've got gut, intestinal permeability, things are getting into the bloodstream. We eat some bread. Unwanted substances, gluten, get into the bloodstream. Gluten can be a problem for people as well. That is an unwanted substance in the bloodstream. The body creates an immune reaction because it's like, well, gluten's in the bloodstream, boom. Sig-A, it's an antibody, production goes up. So the body registers something's up. The body actually tags the substance. So gluten comes in, it's tagging gluten to say gluten is bad, attack gluten. So have an immune response when gluten comes in. Not a bad thing to happen in case next time we have some gluten because that got into the bloodstream somehow. Next time we have another piece of bread, the body sends an alert signal to have the same immune reaction because it perceives it as an invading substance in our bloodstream. And that can cause a food intolerance. And that can happen through anything. That can happen if you're having, some sort of healthy food. It usually happens when we're having more unhealthy, problematic food, but it can happen if you're eating avocado, food intolerance. If you've got a leaky gut, you can actually become intolerant to so many things. That's why people with food intolerances, often it's stemming from the gut. And a lot of the research now is going towards that. Is it not so much the food, it's actually the gut. Because really, we should be able to eat a lot of things. We should be able to tolerate quite a bit if the gut's intact. So this brings into play a question, is food really your friend? I don't think it is. Food doesn't want to be eaten. Food will do whatever it can not to be eaten. And they're going to do that by having lectins and toxins. All foods have it. A really good example is a peanut. So a peanut is surrounded by a shell. Why? To protect itself. It doesn't want to be eaten. Other things like grains, surrounded by a shell, bran, it doesn't want to be eaten. We go through a lot of processing to make sure we can eat them. Vegetables, same thing. If you look at like really potent leaves that can that have actual poisons in them, that if you brush past them, they'll burn you. That's a defense mechanism. So all foods have this defense mechanism in them. It just so happens that a lot of them come from grains, nuts, and legumes. So a lot of these substances have what's called high lectin content, and lectin is like the protective layers that a lot of foods have. And that can cause serious gut irritability, especially if they're not properly prepared. So yeah, these foods can be nutritious, but if we're eating a lot of them and we haven't prepared them properly, and I'll get into preparing later, if we haven't prepared them properly, then we're getting a lot of that lectin content. And that lectin content, because they've already got, think of it like a defense or poisons in them, that's getting into our system and can really do damage to the gut. And so what do we do if we want to have these foods? Grains, nuts, legumes, they're not bad so far. They've got some nutrients in them, but the gut needs to be healthy to start off with, to have them, and also preparing them properly. The reason people soak and sprout grains, for example, oats, the reason people soak oats and sprout them, leave them overnight, is to remove a lot of these lectins. So it's not some sort of hippie technique to get more nutrients out, although it does do that. It's mostly to remove the bad stuff. Lentils and beans, the same thing. Try having beans when they haven't been soaked. That's why a lot of people end up farting them out. Nuts, the same thing. A lot of nuts should be soaked and sprouted. So soaked for about 24 hours and sprouted for about the same. Each food has a different recommendation for how it should be soaked. And a lot of traditional cultures will do this. They're very aware, and often they have their own grain, native grain, that they properly prepare, and it takes a good amount of time to do it. And that does two things. It gets some of the nutrients, it produces some nutrients so they get healthier, and it also removes some of these barriers that the plant inherently has. Oh, and if your gut is chronically inflamed, then I really recommend not having these for about 30 days. Okay, question time and drink time. Steve, any questions about digestion or anything we've spoken about so far? If you've got any questions, just put them in the chat box. Give it another few moments. Otherwise, we can soldier on. Okay, I think we're good to go. Oh, got one. Good. I have a question. Can we tell when our gut is inflamed other than not feeling right? Yep. I feel okay. My stools tell me otherwise. What would you look into for that? Yeah. So to answer these questions, one about when can we tell when our gut is inflamed? Not feeling right is one thing. Fatigue, bloating, constipation, all those sorts of things could lead to an inflamed gut. The second question, if you feel okay but your stools tell you otherwise, I think the best answer for both of those is to get tested. You can do a GI map test, which is easily the most comprehensive gut test there is. I actually offer that as well. And you have a whole list of things, pathogens, bacteria, fungi, what sort of enzyme activity you have in the gut, and that can give you an indication of how your gut is going. That, I think, answers both of those. There's other things like skin conditions if the gut's inflamed, looking at your stools if you're seeing undigested food in there. If your stools, we're going to talk about stools in a bit, but if your stools are runny or if they're really hard to get rid of, then that could be an issue as well. But testing, like always test, like we say, assess, don't guess, if you're ever unsure. Gut-brain axis, this is the cool stuff. So we know there's a connection that goes from the gut to the brain. We spoke about that earlier in the form of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve connects both the gut and the brain. And the microbes within the gut affect the brain. So that causes all sorts of conditions and states. So this is a simplified version of it. A stressor usually goes to the brain, to the adrenal glands. We've spoken about that in the second week, but it can also go to the gut. The stressor can also go to the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands is drawn to the gut as well. It's a confronting picture, isn't it? Sorry about that. Stress. Let's talk about stress. So stress causes inflammation. That's the best way to think about it. It causes inflammation in all parts of the body. And inflammation it can happen at the gut, can happen at the muscles, can happen at the bone. We're talking about at the gut at the moment. So let's talk about SIGA. So secretory IgA, it's mucus lining, and that goes right the way along our gut. We know that the gut is a tube, spoke about that earlier, and the mucus lines the gut. So it forms like a clag sort of substance that's all over. When we're under stress, we know that secretory IgA, that is inhibited. So it downregulates. And that leaves us open to all sorts of infection. SIGA is like our first line of defense. So we want that to be strong. If that's not strong, then we're open to all sorts of other conditions. And we know that stress leads to inhibited IgA. So that's the first thing that can go wrong. And that leads to an inflamed state. Back to our original diagram, if SIGA is low, that leads to our leaky gut and GI distress. But that can just happen through stress alone. And the vagus nerve again. So that can lead to a chronically inflamed state that can happen down here. And that can lead to all sorts of conditions. One of them, like depression, brain fog, anxiety, but also Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. There's a good article by Scientific American about how the Parkinson's is now being looked at with the gut first, as opposed to the brain and then the gut. Mental health as well, guys. So the gut is intimately connected to mental health. So there's a bunch of hormones that are actually created in the gut. One of them is this serotonin-melatonin connection. So tryptophan, you may have heard of tryptophan. That's a precursor to serotonin. Serotonin is a precursor to melatonin. And that's all dependent on the health of the gut. So melatonin is our sleep hormone. So if your gut is not healthy and happy, then good luck getting a good sleep. That can really tie into your mental health. And serotonin as well. That's like think of it like a regulatory hormone that keeps everything pretty cool and calm, and that's tied into to low levels of, well, high levels of depression if we're low levels of serotonin. So if the gut, all of this will start in the gut. Also the cortisol connection. So if we're chronically inflamed at the gut, that can cause cortisol problems. If you think about it, if we're inflamed, we've got a heightened stress response. We know that cortisol is our stress hormone, and that over time leads to a downregulation of hormones. So really inflammation can come anywhere, but in this case, it's really looking at the gut, because it can spread through the body. Any questions about the gut-brain axis? Yeah, I've got a question here about the vagus nerve. Is it essentially the way the brain and the gut talk to each other? Yeah, that's how it works. The vagus nerve is, nerves are like connectors or messengers, and that's how the brain and the gut communicate. So if the brain reads that if the gut sends a signal to the brain that says, I am inflamed, then the brain can become inflamed. And if the brain's inflamed, that's a bad situation to be in. That's when we're going to feel really shit. Likewise, the brain can send a signal to the gut and say, I'm inflamed, and then the gut can become inflamed itself. But as we discussed, the vagus nerve is actually stronger from the gut to the brain as opposed to the brain to the gut. It's got a strong connection from the gut to the brain. So that's why nutrition is so important, because if the gut's healthy, it's going to be sending healthy signals to the brain. Whereas if the nutrition is not healthy and we've got a bunch of invading parasites or whatnot here, or bad bacteria, then that's going to be sending an inflamed signal to the brain. Okay, just got a few more questions here. Just going to get back to where I was. Yeah, okay. Can it become a cycle? Crappy mental health, stress, and then, yeah, absolutely. And it can become like a cascade. So can this cycle of like mental health, stress become a cycle? Absolutely. And then I think behaviors lead to that as well. Like if the gut's unhappy and we're not feeling good, then it can lead to worse behaviors in that sort of effect. So it's harder to exercise, it's harder to get outside,
we can make poorer food decisions, and then that leads to a cascade. Hormones work the same way. Can you reverse a leaky gut? Absolutely. Absolutely, we can heal a leaky gut. That's done by first assessing, doing a test if you actually are inflamed and there's some leaky gut going on, and then going on some sort of protocol to help that. And also lifestyle. I'm going to talk about that later. Lifestyle is so important with this. And what does stimulating it? Good question. What does stimulating the vagus nerve mean? I.e. using ice bath actually mean? Or is it like waking it up? Yeah, it's like waking it up. You can stimulate the vagus nerve. So I got to talk about the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is a parasympathetic nerve. It innervates parasympathetic function in the body. What that means, parasympathetic is like rest and digest. It keeps everything cool. We say rest and digest. Yeah, you can guess that it's from the vagus nerve. The sympathetic nervous response is the fight or flight. So that's when we've got like high action activity going on. So the parasympathetic nerve keeps everything really cool. So when people stimulate the vagus nerve, for example, the best example is if you go and see Dr. Luke the osteo, he might do a massage through your psoas muscle that stimulates the vagus nerve, or the diaphragm that stimulates the vagus nerve. And then you'll feel like good. You'll feel like, oh, this is, I feel really cool and calm here. That's a parasympathetic response. And so if the vagus nerve is not operating strongly, we're going to be more prone to sympathetic activity. We're going to be more prone to anxiety, to fight or flight response. Whereas if our parasympathetic, we call it tone, parasympathetic tone is strong, then we're more likely to be relaxed. And that's the thing that massage, saunas, ice bath in a way works that way too. Good questions. Really good questions. So an unhealthy gut, think of it like an unhealthy garden. Not cool. Unhealthy garden, bad guys can come in, create a bit of rubbish, environment gets polluted. It's not a desirable situation. What does it feel like? So stool chart, this is called the Bristol stool chart. It's really cool. It can tell you how your stool might be correlating with different things in your body. So these are your good stools here. Sausages are always good. Soft blobs, not so good. That can suggest lacking fiber. And watery stools are no good either. Lumps are no good on the other hand too. Healthy gut is a diverse, healthy garden with lots of different species. So a healthy gut is a diverse gut. Just like, in my opinion, a healthy environment or population is a diverse environment with all different types of creatures and people around there. An environment that's stale or only has a few different bacteria or fungi isn't very exciting, and it's not very healthy. It's more fragile, in fact. Whereas a diverse environment is more robust, and that's what we should be going towards. And that's why eating a diverse diet is so important, because it can give you exposure to a range of different things. And that brings up the hygiene hypothesis. Some of you may have heard of this before. This is pretty interesting right now, given what we're going through, because the time now is not, it doesn't look fondly upon the hygiene hypothesis. But hygiene hypothesis posits that many of the problems we face, asthma, allergies, autoimmunity, may be the result of too little interaction between our immune system and infectious items. Infectious items can be dirt, mud, different sort of stimulations to the immune system that we should get, that we're expecting to get from an early age. But with everything being so sterile right now, those areas of our body atrophy because we don't have the stimulation that they need to develop. And when they don't develop, they atrophy, and it leaves us more sensitive to them. So the hygiene hypothesis says, hey, we need to actually expose ourselves to a little bit of dirt early on, or a little bit of toxin early on, to stimulate the immune system so that when we encounter them later on, we know what to do. It makes sense. A lot of vaccinations work this way as well. Give a little bit to create a response so that we're stronger long term. The observations of the hygiene hypothesis, how it comes about, the gut bacteria of non-westernized populations appear to be more diverse in the stool tests that they've done. than westernized populations. Children in westernized societies who were raised around animals or on farms appear to have a strong gut profile, strong and diverse gut profile, tend to not get sick as much. And the likelihood between the two groups developing allergies, autoimmunity, inflammatory bowel disease is substantially lower than groups who are not from hunter-gatherer societies or didn't grow up around animals, so city kids essentially. And this is seeing a real change in behavior. A lot of people are taking this stuff seriously now, to the point where C-sections, the birthing is starting to be questioned, or at least the vaginal fluid, that's the first layer of, it's our first taste of an immune system comes from the vaginal layer of mucus. That layer is actually being saved and then given to the baby if they've had a C-section. Okay. Any questions about hygiene hypothesis or anything we've spoken about there? I've got a question here. Why are women more likely to end up with autoimmune disorders? Good question. I don't have a good answer for that. Just trying to think. The gut. No, I don't have a good answer why women are more likely to end up with autoimmune conditions. Alzheimer's, definitely, I can explain that. That's believed to be a crash in hormones, including estrogen, when estrogen goes really, really low. And women rely on that much more than men. That can happen through Alzheimer's, but that's a neurodegenerative disorder, not an autoimmune disorder. Does it make a difference to adults if we try and expose ourselves to dirt more now? Absolutely, definitely. Like, look at someone who spends a lot of time outdoors and is, or spends a lot of time in the country, much more robust immune systems. Look at someone who spends like all day in where I am now, which is a climate-controlled office. The body is just not used to different environments. You're going to have a more severe reaction if you haven't developed that resilience. So definitely you can develop the immune system, a more robust immune system. Hormones, maybe. Can hormones affect autoimmune conditions? Yeah, everything's connected in the body. I'm sure there's a connection there. I can't think of one right now though. Okay. See if we've got any more questions. Gotta say, this is the best group of questions I've had. It's really cool. Gut and obesity, there is a connection here. A few connections, but I've just laid out one, the leptin connection. Leptin is our satiation hormone. So when leptin signaling is strong, then it tells our body, you don't need to eat anymore, which is good. Because when leptin signaling is broken, the body's like, mate, you've got to eat. I'm still hungry. I've just eaten a chocolate cake or a whole block of chocolate, but I still need more food. Not a great situation to be in. So when the leptin signaling is good, then we can stop eating. And leptin is released from a lining in the stomach. So if the gut health is good, then leptin signaling is going to be good as well. So, and that increases our metabolic rate. Metabolic rate increases CKK hormone, and that says I'm full. So that's the desirable situation. When things don't go well, when nutrients are absorbed through the intestinal lining, when leptin sensitivity is strong, the hormone PYY is released, and that promotes good sensitivity of leptin. But when we overeat carbohydrates, and the gut secretes less PYY, that can lead us to overeat and think that we're actually hungrier than we are. Protein is why protein's so good for body composition, fat loss, mostly muscle gain, both of them, great. Has a really strong PYY connection. Same with fat. Fat's got a pretty good one. Carbs have a weaker one. And that's why knowing your macros is important. So carbs up here, these guys, yeah, on their own, not so great. If they're combined in a full meal to create a good blood sugar response, create a good leptin response, that's a better way to go.
Proteins on their own, these guys are just really good. You can see here the connection between fat and carbs when they're combined. Oh man, that's a bad road to go down, and that causes. We spoke about leptin. The leptin response will be broken. We won't be reading the leptin. The brain won't be reading leptin like it should be. You're actually still producing leptin, but the brain's not reading it. It's thinking, where is it? Where is it? But it's still floating around there. Also, what no, I won't talk about that. That's going down another road. But just know that the gut has an intimate role with body composition. Any questions about the gut hormones and digestion or body composition there? And don't worry, I'm going to give you some tips soon. All right. So what upsets the gut? I had a few questions about this. I'll answer that question in a tick. What upsets the gut? So processed foods, we know that upsets the gut. It can lead to bad gut bacteria, sugar in particular. Sugar can really hang around in the gut and cause an overgrowth of bad bacteria. A condition called SIBO, small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, is really tied to high consumption of processed foods. Omega-6 oils, the same thing. Omega-6 oils like your vegetable oils, canola oil, soybean oil, all the stuff in processed foods. So really processed foods, connection between fat and sugar. Back to here, fat and sugar, these guys. Processed oils and processed carbohydrates. That is one to stay away from. Low fiber, no surprises there. We need fiber to stimulate the gut and help us digest food. Stress, we talked about the SIG-A connection there. Stress is going to lower our SIG-A production and leave us open to invading pathogens. Infection is probably the biggest one. Like if you've got a parasite infection, then you need to get that treated through antibiotics or probiotics or some sort of protocol. A bacterial infection can do it as well. Fungi overgrowth can do it too. That all happens at the gut. And that's not as simple as just eating more healthy food. That actually needs to be treated properly. We know that antibiotics can lead to increased intestinal permeability over time. So if you've had a lot of antibiotic exposure, then we know that can upset the gut and lead to a more fragile gut. You know how antibiotics work. You take them in and it destroys a lot of the bad bacteria, which is good. That's why they're awesome, and they probably wouldn't be here without them. But they will also attack the good stuff. And that's why antibiotics now are being prescribed a lot with probiotics to promote the good bacteria as well as the bad. But when the antibiotics are just chosen and we're just relying on those without taking into account everything else, that's when problems can happen. C-section, I spoke about that. C-section birthing, that the process of that leads to decreased immunity. So the baby needs to have exposure to the vaginal fluid to have the right immune response to develop the robust immune system over time. Doesn't mean that if you've been a C-section baby, that it's all doom and gloom. It can be developed. But they say about 3 years that it takes to develop the normal immune system. So exposure to animals are really good. Exposure to dirt is really good. Being outside, being barefoot on the grass is really good, and in the dirt. Circadian rhythm, sleep is so important with this. Like, yeah, if your sleep's upset or you're getting a lot of light exposure at night, then digestion will be impaired. Like, think about it. You're a biological creature. You're used to digesting food at a certain period of time, and we operate with the sun and the moon. This is why if you go to a different time zone, say if I fly to England tomorrow, I probably won't be able to go to the toilet properly for like a week, because the body's like, hey mate, I'm not used to digesting food at this time. What the hell's going on? And it can take a long time to get to a regular digestion schedule because you're changing everything. I've had this happen a lot with people who have relocated and have come to me and have said, hey, I haven't been to the toilet in a week. just like, it's fine. It's going to be okay. You just need to get good sun exposure, especially sun on that area tends to help as well. Get to bed on time and just promote a good rhythm again, a normal rhythm for that environment. How to keep the guts healthy and happy. So removing inflammatory foods. That's the first thing we should do. Inflammatory is subjective because different things are inflammatory for different people. That's why knowing what the right diet is for you is important. But we know that eating non-processed food is going to be a good option. Fermentable fibers and fermentable foods. So fermentable fibers, this is onions, garlics, artichokes. Fermented foods, this is your probiotics. So this is your sauerkrauts, your kombuchas, probiotics, the probiotic supplement. Kefir is a good one as well. I think sauerkraut's a really good one. And fermented veggies, all these fermented veggies here. And a lot of the veggies we should eat, they should actually be fermented. That's how we get the good stuff out of them. Treat any pathogens. So if there is something underlying under the hood, you can eat all the fermented food you want, but if you've got something underlying, that needs to be addressed. And you do that by testing, doing a GI map test. Sleep, spoke about that, how important that is. Exercise, just the right amount of exercise. Don't go too crazy with it. That can upset the gut as well through a hormone cascade. And stress ties into exercise. If we're going too hard with these two, that can upset the gut as well. And I've had that myself when I've been overtrained. The first thing to be upset is the gut. What foods can help? Had a few questions about foods. So fermented foods, we want to be getting a wealth of these. These are the stuff that have a diverse range. We spoke about diversity in the gut of bacteria. So unpasteurized sauerkraut, kimchi, kombucha, yogurt, kefir, they've got some great probiotics in there that help promote good bacteria. And fermentable fibers, artichoke, onion, garlic, plantains are a good one as well. Resistant starch that comes off rice. It's like the layer of rice that's on top, and potatoes. That's all good stuff, fermentable fibers. Okay, question time. If you're trying to increase fat for satiety, is dairy a good option? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think dairy is a good option, providing you tolerate it okay. Yep. Yeah, dairy, there's different fats as well. Omega-3 fatty acids are really good too. Fat's a funny one because it will increase satiety, but it's very caloric dense. So there is a point where there's a sweet spot. Like it's not like the more fat we eat, the more satiated, well, somewhat the more satiated we're going to be. But there is a cost in that we're going to be eating a lot of calories as well. So we want to be getting just the right amount of fats. I think people can take that overboard. That sort of happened with the paleo movement. People were like, yeah, we're going to cut the carbohydrates. And yeah, that was good. But then a lot of people replace it with fat. And fat, yeah, it's nutrient dense and all, but it can also send your calories skyward. Okay. We have come to, oh my God, time is flying. We have come to the end, guys. If you're interested in more of what I talked about and you want to talk about the gut or the hormones or the brain or some remote coaching, from remote coaching for fitness, nutrition, and lifestyle, so it really is a whole package of programming for fitness and nutrition to suit the programming and addressing health from the ground up. And part of that is the gut. And we do testing then, hormone testing as well. If you want to speak about your options there, feel free to reach out. Or if you just got any general questions about anything we've spoken about today, feel free to reach out. I realize I've found with the gut over the years, this is a topic that I think a lot of people suffer from, but are a little bit embarrassed to talk about. Please don't be, because it really is important, because it's tied into, we've seen how much it ties into our health. And it can be something that can ground a lot of people for many years before they do anything about it. So yeah, don't be afraid to get in touch and ask any questions you might have. But thank you very much for tuning in. Awesome set of questions. I had a lot of fun answering them. And yeah, the gut, there's so much we don't know about the gut right now. There's a lot we do know, but so much we don't know. So the information I've given you is relevant right now, but like anything with nutrition, everything changes with research and more what we do. But always take into account how you feel, how you look, feel, how you perform as well. and make decisions based on that. I've got a few questions. Oh no, just thank you messages. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it.